Reverend Kirkpatrick Tyler. I am 39 years old, just for a couple of months. I serve as the pastor of St. Mark AME Church, Los Angeles. And I've had the privilege of serving here for the last 5 years. So I was appointed here in 2016 and have been pastoring here ever since. It's been a great opportunity. Some wonderful people, have learned a lot, have had the joy of serving the community.
So what made you become a pastor?
Oh man, I was blessed to be born into an awesome family on both sides of people that loved God. My foremost inspiration is my grandmother, Bishop Carolyn Tyler Guidry, who, when I was young, I would take trips with her when she would go and preach at different churches or for different conferences. When I was really little, I would be her road dog. And so I'd hop in the car with her and go with her and get a chance to see her. And I think I was about 8 years old. And I told her that I was going to be a minister just like her, that I was going to be a pastor just like her. And just seeing her preach and seeing the way that she loved on people and engaged and interacted with them, I think is what was the inspiration. Like, you know, of course, there's the calling, but like the tangible thing that made me, that inspired me was my grandmother. And then after her, I'd have to say my uncle, Reverend Timothy Tyler, who's also my godfather, was another inspiration. And seeing his fire for God's people, his ministry. And so when I was 8 years old, I declared that I wanted to be a preacher, you know, for as much as an 8-year-old knows. When I turned 16, I accepted my calling to preach, and I preached my first sermon at Ward AME Church. And then throughout my life, I've had the opportunity to spend close, intimate time with amazing preachers, and just having that type of like up close personal engagement with those folks. Bishop Decatur Ward Nichols, who was the youngest elected bishop to the AME Church. And I think when he passed away, he was one of the oldest living bishops. But when I was 16 years old, 16, 17, somewhere in there, we were having hosting Bishop's Council here in Los Angeles, and Bishop Nichols, or Papa Nick, that like people call him, was here, and I got the assignment to watch after him, because he was, I think at that point, he may have been like 99 or something like that. And because of the impact that he had on people's lives, he would ride around in a wheelchair, because when people see him, they, "Oh, Papa Nick," and they run up and shake him and hug him, and you know, and so I was actually really upset, because as a 16-year-old at conference, you want to run around and hang out with your friends and do all of that stuff, and here I am feeling like now I got it stuck with pushing this old pastor around. That's what was in my head before I understood what God was doing, like just being honest. So, you know, in line with that, like had awesome influences, like Pastor Ron Wright, like Bishop C. Garnett Henning, Pastor John Cager. Like, just God has consistently allowed me to be in close, intimate proximity to men and women who really loved God, right? And have allowed them to touch my life in transformational ways. And so even at times when I was running away from the ministry because I felt like I was too young and I didn't want to do that, even at times when I was mad with God, I still had the influence of all of these awesome men and women of God, and the imprints that they made on my life that helped me to stay on the path even when I thought I was jumping off of it.
You mentioned your uncle and your grandma. Do you think because of them being in the AME system, like, made you want to be a part of it, or how did they like have an impact on you?
Kinda. I was born because of the AME church. You know, like if it wasn't for the AME church, if my grandmother hadn't got assigned to First AME Indio, my parents wouldn't have met. You know, idealistically, like if we think about things in those terms. So I'm a real AME baby, like for real, for real. I think that my grandmother and my uncle were what kept me close, right? Because there's a time when I left the church. I took like 4 years where like one of those years I wasn't going to church at all. One of those years I was worshiping with a non-denominational church, and 2 of those years I was serving in the Lutheran church and had really committed to serving in the pastorate in the Lutheran church. And I like talked to my uncle. I remember during General Conference 2016 maybe, and I told him, I was like, hey, they're gonna pay for seminary and they got a church lined up for me and all types of stuff. And he was like, yeah, you need to go there because we're not gonna do that for you. You know, so I think their honesty and their willingness to let me chart my own path is what called me back and what made me stay. That was their influence, right? Their openness to allow me to figure it out, and their love for the church. I think in addition to that, there's not a better institution for African people in America than church. And it had, like, we have challenges, we have struggles, we have problems, but there's not a place in history where African Methodism has not left its imprint in America and in the world. Every time that we talk about great people, either them directly or somewhere in their life, is the impact of the AME church. Even up to today, when we talk about Sandra Bland, you know, when we talk about sisters and brothers that have led movements, the fire of African Methodism, we talk about James Cone, like even folks that leave the church and make ripples and earthquakes in other places, at some point were touched by the Church of Allen. And that always has been in my head, right? That always is in my heart, that God was very intentional about creating African Methodism. I grew up in an AME church that provided more than just Sunday service. Like I know martial arts because I went to an AME church. I know public speaking and Robert's Rules of Order and how to organize and programs and protest and politics. Like I know very important parts of my life because I came up in African Methodism. And so my family influence, through my grandmother, my grandfather for that matter, my parents, my great aunt, you know, because I think that's the other part is that, like I said, like I'm an AME baby. And so my grandmother and my uncle were ordained ministers, but then there's also Miss Polk and my grandmother Ernette Bradley, you know, like those are people who, you know, Brother Tylette, those are people who were in this little tiny church, these giant people who loved God, who were wise, who were steadfast, who loved God's people. So I think like to answer your question, probably in the briefness that you would prefer, there's like this wide universe of influence that involves relationships, family connections, and then just like the spirit and fire that God set.